I welcome you to this event entitled Strengthening IBSA's Role in Global Development. This event today is co-organized by CEBRI, by the Embassy of India in Brazil, by the ORF America, and by SAIIA from South Africa. In advance of the meetings of the leaders of India, Brazil, and South Africa during the G20 Summit next week, this roundtable will identify common ground among the IBSA troika and recommend action plans and reflecting the voice of the Global South in four areas of the discussion today. Agreeing on the pathway for the reform of the global institutions to achieve SDGs, strengthening a global alliance against hunger and poverty, emission life, accelerating energy transition with social justice, and promoting inclusive and equitable digital transformation. So it's a pleasure to have you all. I think this is going to be a very good evening. Fortunately, I won't be able to stay here the entire morning because I have to run from this event to open another U20 event today in Brazil. I'll miss here, but I'll have my colleague Mariana Buquerque who will tell me everything all about the discussions afterwards. It's a pleasure for CEBRI to host you all. It's a pleasure to CEBRI also to have a partnership with the Embassy of India in Brazil, which is a new partnership that is growing very much in the last years, and we hope to continue on that path.
ORF America is a 4-year-old affiliate of ORF, Observer Research Foundation, which is a think tank based in New Delhi, although we at ORF America are based in Washington, D.C. ORF is amongst India's largest think tanks, and at ORF America, we work on US-India relations, but in a global context. And one of the areas we have devoted a lot of attention and resources to over the past year is channeling some of the dialogue and research on differences between the global south and global north and how to cooperate across those lines.
This was an idea that emerged on the 1st of January of 2003 when the heads of state of India and South Africa came for President Lula's inauguration. And since then, I think we've come a long way and developed a rather comprehensive platform for discussions with many important achievements across all kinds of issues: health, education, science and technology, trade and investment, agriculture, military exercises, in addition to the fund, to the fellowships. But what I think is also fundamental in this project was the creation of a certain familiarity among personalities from the three countries. So whether in government or business or academia, the three countries had a lot in common and so much to share, but the distance had kept them, let's say, relatively little aware of their specificities. So this is one area where I think really a big impact has been achieved, to the point where Brazilians feel very much at home nowadays in India, and Indians in Brazil, in South Africa likewise. The distance has been considerably shortened by the existence of this mechanism, and I think that's already no small accomplishment. I think it's important also to highlight that a very fortuitous coincidence or circumstance has emerged where the three countries have succeeded each other presiding over the G20. So in a demonstration of a very, let's say, mature, heightened sense of responsibility that they can manifest in today's complicated geopolitical environment. So, first India, now Brazil, next comes South Africa, with agendas that are very compatible, that reinforce each other, each country with its own strengths and, let's say, regional and global influence. I have developed this idea in other talks that I've had this week here in Rio, where I'd like to consider the three of us actually regional powers of global influence. This is I think, a more interesting way to describe the three countries than middle powers. I think middle powers actually lends itself to confusion. But the fact that the three countries here have a very strong regional footprint and presence, but also engage internationally across regions and in the multilateral institutions, is what really distinguishes us. And there's scope for multiplying contacts at the United Nations, the economic institutions in Washington, WTO, etc., but also within smaller groups in which the three of us are participants. So on environmental issues, for example, the BASIC platform, which brings together IBSA plus China. Within BRICS, now BRICS plus, we of course have an important role to play as three vibrant multi-ethnic democracies. I think we share very similar concerns regarding not only hunger and poverty, which is the priority number one. So there is no need to emphasize how significant this is to give a boost to SDG implementation that is really not proceeding satisfactorily. So these are two essential sustainable development goals without which the others will probably not advance either. And I think the launching of the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty here in Rio will be an important legacy of this Brazilian G20. On the sustainability and climate justice and acceleration of energy transition, this is an area where I think Brazil has a particular leadership to demonstrate. We have the cleanest energy mix among G20 participants. By far, the percentage of renewables in our energy mix is about 50%, whereas world average is more close to 15. Our electricity grid is reliant 90% or plus on renewables. So we are eager to share our experience, but also to advance more deeply, because even here in Brazil, we have some challenges that have to be met with a very kind of specific profile, given the Amazon rainforest that is the major source of our own greenhouse gas emissions. And finally, the third priority has to do with improving global governance. Again, the alignment among the three countries is, I would say, close to absolute. I would like to encourage IBSA to take the following stand. You know, those of us who uphold, as we do, democratic principles domestically should also apply democratic principles internationally. So that means tackling at least two different areas. I was sharing these ideas yesterday at CEBRI. One of them is that nobody is above the law. I mean, just as domestically, it is unacceptable that wealthy or politically powerful individuals do not file income tax returns or consider themselves to be not constrained by, I don't know, traffic lights, to give another example. I think the same reasoning should apply internationally. And unfortunately, we see a lot of violation of international law and international humanitarian law taking place before our very eyes. And I think we need to take very strong stands against this.
IBSA is all about democracy, and this year especially is the year of democracy. When we look at the number of elections around the world, I don't know, we're talking of something like some 3 billion people would have voted in the elections this year. So something really remarkable that after almost 100 years, we have such major elections happening back to back in 1 year. And so I believe this forum is really fitting that here we are sitting in the year of elections and talking as three countries which are leaders of democracy and sharing our ideas. And at the same time, when we look at the bulk of the elections in terms of population wise, it's again in our three countries. You know, Brazil, of course, did not have the national election, but they did have the municipal election, in which all the almost about 200 million people they voted. I mean, except for the children. And it is a very impressive election process in Brazil. You know, coming from, as we say, the mother of elections in India, coming here to Brazil and watching how smoothly the elections are conducted, a very impressive performance. My hearty congratulations to the Brazilian authorities on the successful elections, because I was witness to all the elections here over the past 4 years. It's been a fascinating experience. And when we look at IBSA when it started, and when we look at today where we are, it's something very remarkable, you know, in terms of how it has evolved over the years and what we have achieved and what more we could have achieved and what prevented us from realizing even more than what we did. It's what in last night I was having a chat with Dhruv. I should mention one point which struck me was that one important point is that we are of course working together for reform of global institutions. We are of course looking to find solutions for innovative financing, for meeting our development challenges, to meet the limitations of finance. We are working together to find alternative methods for promoting sustainable development. But fundamentally, how I look at it is that there's a big change which has happened, and the change is technology. Before, technology was limited, and so you were dependent upon the technology providers. But today, we have become masters of our own technology also, which is what digital inclusion is all about. By providing digital technology, by providing access to digital technology, we are able to find our own solutions to the challenges. We are not today as dependent as we are on technology providers. Now, in the case of India, if you look at it, a country perhaps which still had limited literacy, so to say, in a span of what, 7 years, today we have more than 1 billion people who are fully connected to the internet. Not even 7 years. The actual initiative started in 2015. In 5 years, you got 1 billion people connected to the internet. So now suddenly they started to find their own solutions. And that's what it's all about. Once you provide them the technology, and that is why I'm very happy that in today's discussion, one of the key areas and focus is on digital inclusion. Because by finding our own solutions, we're able to prove that we as a global south can be leaders in shaping the agenda for the future. That we are able to be independent of the pressures which traditionally we face from. And we're able to find meaningful solutions for our own people. And as our Prime Minister said, it's all about democratization of technology. Because here in Brazil also I say the same, that a technology has to be implementable in Sao Paulo and also in Belém. Or in India, as you say, it has to be implementable in Bombay, somewhere in the south, in the remote parts of India. And that is the beauty of technology. That's the beauty of digital inclusion, that it's all encompassing, it's inclusive. It really enables everybody to find their own solutions. Regional powers of global influence. I think today that is what it is, because when you look at 23 years ago when IBSA was founded, we are really large countries, but we believe we did not really have that enough adequate economic heft. But today it has changed. Today, when you look at the size and scale of our economies, and when you look at the three countries put together, we're talking of India, which is hitting 4 trillion, and Brazil, which is already 2 trillion plus, and then with South Africa sitting there comfortably growing rapidly. And so we're talking of an economic heft of almost $6 trillion plus. Now, that was not the case 20 years ago, and $6 trillion is a lot of cash to spend. And it does give you a certain say in global affairs. And I believe time has come for us also to recognize that what we are today, and accordingly also reorient our position and approaches. And as you correctly said, in terms of reforming of the various institutions. And in addition to, of course, the population. I mean, today, jointly, we have almost 25% of the global population between the three countries. And that's a large percentage of the global community to which we are accountable for and who look up to give them the leadership in terms of meeting their socio-economic aspirations. The IPSA Fund has been a story of success. They have done projects in almost 50 countries as of date, and many projects which are meeting local community needs, which are meeting the aspirations of the local communities in partnership with the national governments. One difference with the IPSA Fund is that it is a fund which is driven by the recipient countries. That has been also India's approach to supporting our friends and partners, and that has been Brazil's approach also. That we work as a partner with the receiving countries. We identify the projects jointly and we work with them to shape the projects and to deliver on the projects. It is not a donor driven, but it's more a recipient driven process, the IPSA Fund. Here also, last year we announced in our presidency in the G20 presidency of India, One Sand, One World, One Earth Alliance, under which the whole idea was to connect the renewable energy network around the world and to help share experiences and expertise and to basically reduce the cost and time taken to adopt the policy frameworks in developing renewable energy matrix around the different countries. And here the energy transition has been a challenge because it again relates to the technology. And as I mentioned, that is where we have the success story of Brazil's biofuels, the setting up of the Global Biofuel Alliance. But an important element in the energy transition is also the jobs, upskilling of the jobs, the greening of the jobs, and its impact overall on the employment sector. And hence, that is another area in which we have been actively engaged. We have been engaged in sharing of our expertise. We have been engaged in sharing of our knowledge. And how do we support this transfer of the skill set to the different communities, especially in the global south? And that is another area in which I believe IBSA can also take the lead in sharing its expertise and knowledge. Brazil has been doing some commendable work in that field. And I believe there's a lot of scope. And of course, in India, we have a very ambitious project. Right now, this year, our Prime Minister has announced an internship of almost 50 million youngsters. 50 million youngsters would be attached to the different corporates for them to learn, to understand, and to be part of the emerging new economy in which is coming up in India. So there are a lot of many initiatives which we can share with our friends in the global south. And it's all about IBSA's leadership. As the three large economies, as the three large countries, as the three large leaders of the global south. And so there are so many individual experiences, individual expertise, and joint expertise, which we are in a position to share with our friends.
It goes without saying that South Africa seeks to continue the pro-global South agenda advance through these presidencies. And of course, I can also include Indonesia as part of the, the countries that have been at the forefront of ensuring that our agenda as the global South is not marginalized in the context of the discussions within the G20. The ambassador of India, of course, highlighted a very important point, which we need to consider quite seriously as IBSA, in that we are convening within a very a different context compared to what was the situation when the G20 was initially founded. The world is a much divided place than it was all those years ago. The geopolitical divisions are widening. And this, of course, can be seen in the very difficult discussions currently happening in the negotiations I've referred to, especially on the question of geopolitics. We, as Ambassador Reddy has indicated, in what we can refer to as the year of elections. And of course, we have seen some shifts, which of course necessitates that the IBSA be able to analyze what this impact has for the strategic agenda of the grouping. So it is very important that we strengthen and deepen the coordination as IBSA countries, especially in an important platform such as the G20. We, of course, as IBSA, have positioned ourselves as champions of advancing the global governance reform. For example, during his tenure as BRICS chair, India championed the adoption of a comprehensive minister statement on the reform agenda, including the global financial architecture and trade system. This issue was taken forward by us in 2023 when we were the chair of BRICS, and of course, recently Brazil, during its presidency of the G20, championed a very important initiative called the Call to Action for Global Governance Reform of the UN. And of course, when we met in New York on the margins of the General Assembly High Level Week, we did adopt this call to action, which of course will also find expression in the Rio Leaders Declaration. It goes without saying that during her presidency of the G20, South Africa will continue the reform agenda, especially as it benefits the developing global South.
What I think united the IBSA countries, and it was already mentioned by Ambassador Patriota, is that the three countries foster democracy on the two levels. We want democracy inside, and we want also democracy outside. And the way we foster that is trying to reduce asymmetries. And we have been doing it with our public policies nationally. We have cooperating to doing programs devoted to hunger, to poverty, to technical cooperation. But we also do that internationally. And that's one of the things that should not be taken for granted. We have three large democracies that together want to move the system in the same direction. Of course, the instruments and the priorities can change and can be adapted, but in that sense, we have a strong bond between us. But despite of that, there is still a lot of room to be covered by not only the trilateral cooperation between the three countries, but the bilateral cooperation between them. And why I say that is because I've been studying India and Brazil for a while now, and I always got the perspective that the bilateral relations between Brazil and India requires a lot of political will to be strengthened. It is not what I call a given relation. And why do I say that? Let me explain it briefly. No matter who is our president, Brazil will always have a strong ties with the US. Brazil will always have a strong tie with Argentina. And that's the geography speaking, right? We will always have a strong tie with Portugal. And that's history speaking. But with India and with South Africa, it needs to be reframed into a narrative that the three countries matter and they matter to each other and they matter together. And that's the way diplomacy should move, in my view. We need to uh, share more information, intellectual but also practical information on how the three countries can cooperate. And I think IBSA was a good example of how the political will is required to make that process move forward. As Ambassador Patriota, with his first-hand insight, shared with us, when the IBSA Forum was originally proposed, it was in a moment where Brazil looked at the Global South with a different lenses. And because of that, we managed to advocate for more Global South alliances, and IBSA was one of them. It was one of the first, as it was in January 1st. They didn't know that information. So it was one of the first. And then we tried to build a narrative that the three countries could work together. For some time, the IBSA trilogue was a little bit dormant. And it was a little bit dormant because of political will. And it goes the three ways. It was not only Brazil that changed its priority, but also India built another alliances, for example, the Quad. South Africa also tried to focus a little bit more on the free trade areas and zones inside Africa, which is important as well. Brazil has with South Africa the ZOPAC as well, the Zone of Peace and Cooperation of the South Atlantic. So it was another coalition that was built a little bit before. But now we have a good momentum. We have a good opportunity to relaunch IBSA, and that's why I think this is a very timely opportunity for us. And the G20 provided us with the platform to do so. The three countries, we were together in the troika, as we all know, and we got the opportunity to strengthen our ties again and to show not only to the world but especially to ourselves what the cooperation between India, Brazil, and South Africa can accomplish. So that's a good timing and a good momentum to relaunch that conversation. And it goes in the same moment where BRICS is enlarging. And because BRICS is enlarging, and of course, any expansion of any coalition changes the internal dynamic of power, it is also enlarging in a different direction of what unites the IBSA countries, which is democracy. So I don't see them as competing structures. I think we can use them for whatever they fit. But in the IBSA now, we have a differential, I would say, like an asset to relaunch IBSA on those terms. We have already some indications that the three countries want to have and wants a shared perspective on how to reform global governance. For example, in 2019, the IBSA launched a joint statement on the reform of the multilateral system, broadly speaking. So in that statement, we talked not only about the Security Council, which of course is a common desire of the three countries, but also about the UN as a whole, and also the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and the other institutions where the asymmetry that we want to shrinken is most prominent. The following year, in 2020, then we did a specific joint statement on the reform of the Security Council, in which the three countries expressed mutual support for each other's candidacies. And that's the type of document that you cannot put into the BRICS agenda, because then you have the China factor, and we know that China does not support the three IBSA countries to be permanent members of the Security Council. So it was it was also a good a moment to express how the three countries mutually support each other. And then let's just speed it up to this year. This year, in parallel to the General Assembly, the ministers launched another joint statement in which they talked about the reform of the Security Council, building on the Pact of the Future and the Summit of the Future window of opportunity to put forward more reform proposals. And of course, I won't delve into the reform for the Security Council because Ambassador Patriota already covered it, but they also mentioned the need to reform the Peace Building Commission. And that was a topic that was overshadowed by the Security Council main endeavor that the three countries shared. But the idea that we have three global south countries with concrete and objective perspective of how to reform the Peace Building Commission is remarkable, and we should not take that for granted. And one of the proposals that they were discussing about the Peace Building Commission was to expand the mandate and give the Peace Building Commission more instruments and more tools to operate not only in the post-conflict phase, but also to start following the process throughout the negotiation of the resolutions and the mandates. And the three countries, of course, supported the call to action that Brazil did on the reform of multilateral reform as a G20 document that was then endorsed by a larger membership of the UN. And I was with Ambassador Patriota in another panel yesterday, and he also mentioned that these call of actions should not be taken for granted, and I second that. I completely agree. So we have now already inside the IBSA material and documentation that can help us exert the political pressure we need to relaunch and revamp how the group can cooperate, and we can, in that specific asset, move them towards democracy, and democracy domestically, but also democracy in the international system. And we cannot get there until there is a reform of the global governance. And I think the three IBSA countries already acknowledged, accepted, and are moving in that direction.
There's an opportunity for Brazil, India, and South Africa with its collective knowledge and collective experience and collective capacity to be able to bring these ideas on energy transition and how to manage the finance along with the technology. We can do a mapping of who does what, biofuels in Brazil, as Pamela was mentioning, maybe green hydrogen in India. We have a green hydrogen mission. We're very, very serious about green hydrogen, and maybe the decarbonization of the grid in South Africa. So those are the first and the second, the debt and the climate finance and technology. And the third, I would say, is inclusive digitalization. I think Ambassador Reddy, you mentioned this, and Ambassador Kant has mentioned many, many times. I think we are at a very critical moment, and in this time of technological change, one is the opportunity side and the other is the threat side. And if you look at what the outcome of the elections in the United States, I don't see any possibility now of regulation of new technology or the new threats of AI and quantum and others coming from the United States. It's going to be pretty much of a free-for-all for the Silicon Valley-led investors to push the boundaries as far as possible. And that's something that for developing countries, it's going to be a challenge. How do we manage to keep our digital sovereignty and make sure that digitalization is for the good rather than being imposed? And that's the opportunity where countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa have significant capacity that we have built over the years on the digital space, both in terms of using digital technologies for governance, digital governance, cybersecurity, digital payments. All these we can try to package in one offer to other countries which actually are in need of that, including regulation built in. So I think on the digital space, moving the needle from just being recipients to how do we control what those technologies, how that impact us as a community of developing countries. The IBSA, and we have been associated with IBSA for many years. My friend Fabio and I, we've grown old while we have been doing IBSA work, and Pamela as well. I think it's a very I would say exciting time. And as Ambassador Reddy, you mentioned that these countries are not small countries anymore. These are countries with economic power and with influence, as Ambassador Patriota mentioned, that these are regional powers with heft. And that is something that I'm looking forward to, the new revitalized IBSA and taking it forward.
Let me introduce Amitabh Khan. We're very privileged to have him here with us. He's India's G20 Sherpa. He was really instrumental in the process last year that India led as part of the G20 that resulted in the New Delhi Declaration. Prior to that, had a long and storied, legendary career in the Indian civil services. For a while, was in charge of investments to India, and his name. Anytime you told a business person when his name came up, somebody who was trying to invest in India, he was the go-to person for a lot of the private sector. So we're really privileged to have him with us to share some of his thoughts. He's come from the negotiations, the Sherpa negotiations. So perhaps maybe for about 10 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes, feel free to share your thoughts on the status of ongoing negotiations and also how we can be a bit more ambitious and lift the agenda both for IBSA and within the G20.
Thank you, Dhruv, and Ambassador Reddy, Ambassador Patriota, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to be here. Let me compliment all of you for organizing this conference on the sideline of the G20 Summit in Rio. Let me first give you a perspective of what's happening around us and the role which IBSA can play in that. First of all, global growth at about roughly 3% is the lowest from the turn of the century. And global growth was averaging about 4%. It's slumped to about 3%. But in this, the contribution of the developed world is about 1.8%. And the contribution of emerging markets in the global south is about 4.4%. Now, according to IMF and World Bank, almost 3/4 of the growth for the next 3 decades will be driven by the global south and the emerging markets. And therefore, the global south and emerging markets are important not for just the global south, but they are important for the global north, that they will not be able to drive their growth without the global south. And the reason for that is that the demographics in these countries is young. The population is aging in the western part of the world, in Europe, America, and many other parts of the world, whereas the population in Africa, South America, and India is fairly young. So demographics is critical. The number 2 point I want to make is that it's important to understand that the world today is in the global south, there are close to about 18 countries where the interest payment which these countries, 18 countries give is more than their amount which they spent on education. And there are 44 countries where the interest payment for them is more than what they, interest payment is 44 countries where the interest payment is more than what they spent on health. And therefore, there are 3.3 billion people in the world today where the interest payment of those countries is more than the amount they spent on health and education. And therefore, virtually nothing is left for them to raise, to put resources into growth or education or health. And therefore, global debt is a very major challenge for the global south. This is critical. This is very important to understand. And the third point I want to make is that climate will be a very critical issue. Climate will be a critical issue because 82% of the total carbon space in the world has already been occupied by the developed world. There is very little space left for South Africa, India, and Brazil to utilize as it grows and expands. And if the world has to meet the 1.5 degrees centigrade target of by 2050, by the mid-century, it's very important for us to understand that unless there are adequate resources made available, there is technology made available, it will be very difficult for these countries to grow and expand because there will be virtually no carbon space left, and therefore an action plan on the new quantifiable allocation of resources from the developed country, which has already occupied all the space, and it continues to do more greenhouse gas emission, is not finalized in COP at Baku. That's very important to my mind, and that's something which we are negotiating right now. And the fourth point I want to make is that it will be very difficult to grow and expand without technology. Our own experience reveals that in India we've lifted 250 million people in the last decade above poverty line. We've been able to do this because we've used technology. In India, everybody has a digital identity. Everybody has a bank account. The digital identity and the mobile numbers linked to the bank account. And we do 50% of the real-time fast payment in the world. But a number of startups are then able to use the payment history to provide credit. Almost, we are able to do stock market transaction in 30 seconds. We are able to provide credit in 1 minute. We are able to buy an insurance policy in 1 minute. And that has led to a huge technological leapfrogging. So to my mind, it will be very difficult to achieve sustainable development goals. And only 17% of the sustainable development goals are on track for 2030. Now, it is in the background of these challenges, we should see that the coalition of the three large democracies from Asia, South America, and Africa, IBSA brings a very unique perspective to global issues. And they are actually pinned by the shared values of inclusivity, diversity, and democracy. And this alliance is very pivotal in addressing the challenges facing the global south. It's very critical from the perspective of lifting people above the poverty line. It's very important for poverty alleviation. It's important for health. It's important for climate resilience. It's important for sustainable development goals. So my view, IBSA is a very, very important player. It will continue to play a very influential role in shaping a just and an inclusive and a more multipolar world of tomorrow. And IBSA is important because in the context of these global challenges, it's the first time that the G20 is being driven by India, Brazil, and South Africa one after another. It's never happened before. So when you hold the pen, when you hold the power to write the document, it's very, very critical and significant. Because we in India, when I wrote the document as the G20 Sherpa, I was speaking the voice of the global south. For generations together, the world The total world order has been written by the western part of the world. The international financial architecture was drafted by them. The multipolar world was decided by them. The United Nations was decided by them, despite the fact that Europe was responsible for World War I, Europe was responsible for World War II, and the Russia-Ukraine war is going on for the last 3.5 years unabated. And therefore, in my view, it's very important that the IBSA plays a very critical role in a multipolar world of tomorrow. It plays a very critical role in the new international financial architecture. It plays a very critical role in deciding the climate discussions which are going on. And therefore, when you wield your power of your pen to draft documents, it's very critical. And therefore, India built up a very ambitious and a forward-looking document for G20. And it could do this. It could do this because Brazil worked with us. South Africa worked with us. We could arrive at a consensus on a very ambitious document. And we had a full consensus document in which G7 fell in line with all of us, with the IBSA countries. They fell in line with IBSA countries because we had the power of the pen. And we could bring consensus to the entire G20 document only because Brazil and South Africa worked with us. And therefore, my experience is that it's now time for the IBSA countries to reshape and reconfigure the world, because the multilateral institutions were designed and shaped at a point of time when it was a post-World War II era. There were no challenges of sustainable development goals. There were no challenges of climate action. These are completely new challenges of the world. And therefore, it's very critical that during the Brazilian presidency, and let me reiterate this point, that India worked with Brazil, Brazil has worked with India, India is working with Brazil during its presidency, and India and Brazil will work with South Africa next year together. And therefore, without each other's partnership, none of us will succeed. And to my mind, we need to build on the legacy of the G20 presidencies in the future as well. It's very important, because if you want to redesign the world, and if you want to redesign the international financial architecture, if you want to negotiate for COP to your advantage, it will not be possible without all of us working together. And therefore, IBSA cooperation and coordination in multilateral groupings is critical. The South-South cooperation is critical. And it's critical because otherwise you'll never get the UNSC permanent membership without working together. It's very important that the reform of the multilateral development bank and institutions will never happen without IBSA and without all three of us working in partnership. The innovation in financial institutions, the financial tools like blended finance, like climate financing mechanism that can cater to the challenges of the developing countries will never happen without IBSA. It will never happen that we are able to push for greater trade reforms and greater trade forum through the great trade forums like World Trade Organization, and push for a far fairer and a far better trade policies that benefit emerging markets without IBSA. The strengthening of the maritime security by conducting joint drills and operation. IBSA can enhance the capabilities and participating navies to respond to common maritime security threats. There are challenges of piracy, there are challenges of smuggling, there are challenges of illegal fishing. All this can never happen in the strategic waters of Indian Ocean and South Atlantic without IBSA. The regional stability and security can never happen without IBSA, and therefore IBSA can contribute to the stability in both Indian and South Atlantic Ocean. And more than anything else, for counter-terrorism, we believe that terrorism in any form or manifestation cannot be justified or condoned, and it requires IBSA to understand, identify, and respond to persistent and emerging terrorist threats. And therefore, we have similar views on important global issues. We have similar views on reform of global institutions. We have similar views on food security, internet governance, cyber security, renewable energy, green hydrogen, waste to energy, and IBSA needs to be the key driver of collaboration. It needs to be the key driver of driving change and and reform, and it has to be the key driver of lifting citizens above poverty line through the use of technology, and only IBSA can do it. Without IBSA, the reform of the world order will never happen, and therefore, to my mind, IBSA will have to play a critical and a very important role, starting with the G20s being held by India, Brazil, and South Africa. And all of us have worked in partnership. To say that we've not carried forward Indonesia's agenda, or Brazil has not carried forward India's agenda, no, that's not absolutely wrong and incorrect. Each one of us has worked in very close partnership, and let me tell you very clearly that India's G20 partnership would never have succeeded without Brazil being a close partner, and Brazil's successful G20 cannot happen without South Africa and India being a very key partner. We have to integrate our relationship, we have to converge with each other and take this forward, and therefore, to my mind, IBSA will be a very critical player in the world of tomorrow.
The Brazilian call is actually to look into the mitigation and the adaptation ways of doing things, to share the technologies, to share the knowledge, and make sure that people can access the funds. So I think that the progress that we did in the Brazilian presidency, if we look across the Sherpa and the finance track, was precisely to look at the financing that we need to have and we need to unlock so that these activities can be actually funded. We have too many funds. For the environmental and global ones, we have 4 major funds. And it was a clear diagnostic that it's not easy for the least developed countries to have access to it. It's quite complicated. It's tiring, it takes time, it's time consuming, and it's time consuming even for countries like Brazil, that has a bureaucracy, that has a capacity to get access to. For the least developed countries, it's going to be much worse. So in terms, if we are talking here about solidarity, equity, and sustainability, that's something that the IBS countries can do together. We have the IBSA funds. That's something that can also be linked to the Global Alliance, that also can speak to food security as a second layer of priority in the case of South Africa. Perhaps the 3 countries, the troika, should come together in the assessment, in the joint assessment of the achievements of the G20 for the Global South, and perhaps invite Indonesia to also join and look at what has been achieved so that we can have a better agenda when we transition to the United States in uncertain conditions. The other aspect that I think it's important, with the new IBS presidency, I think that Brazil should invite the IBSA countries to think together and have a common position for the COP. We are not going to have IBSA next year anymore, but we are going to have BRICS, and we heard yesterday, we had a side event at IPEA that the Brazilian government is going to try to get some common agreement between the BRICS country to take it to the COP. Perhaps it would be easier to get this agreement with the IBSA countries and take it to the COP and try to make an impact on that. And then we can think of a revamped IBSA funds, a revamped common position that brings together the life approach with the sustainable development that Brazil had as its second priority. Also look at energy transitions and what we really mean when we say just transitions. What are the technologies and what the Global South is doing, particularly IBS, in terms of facilitating access to other countries to the technologies that are needed to mitigate climate change and to adapt to the conditions that the climate change has already put ourselves in.
So we've been hearing the whole morning how IBSA is an absolutely unique alliance, and the 3 countries bring together this multicultural and democratic approach, and who have demonstrated consistently that we have championed the cause for the world. I think we don't need to echo that more. But I'll just focus on 3 practical points on what is important to take IBSA forward. So we're convinced that it's important, we're convinced it's necessary. And the 3 would be on the coordination, the delegation, and the concrete action plans that we need to take forward. And in terms of the coordination, fundamentally, what is the grounding of IBSA? We can draw on our common positions, we can leverage from each other's strengths, and
have this unified approach in doing so. In terms of South Africa, the strengths and priorities are equal almost to Brazil and India, but most importantly and most significantly, they have the African context in which they're working on. And there specifically, I want to address the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which I think that the coordination there is fundamental in how we strengthen this, the IBSA, which will offer then solutions in taking the context forward, and how we can then bring, because the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is signed to actually lift the continent off its poverty and take it to a progressive economic trajectory. So I think that will be very, very significant to see how we can leverage that. Then the other thing is the delegation of concrete action in terms of who leads what. I think reflecting on that voice I said earlier, it's important to launch the communication campaign, I think, for highlighting what IBSA's challenges were, but most importantly, what are the future goals and how we want to do that. It is important, and as you've heard, it's important for leveraging on the work of think tanks, and therefore I associate myself with the ORF, with RIS, etc., because I think we need to invest in the joint research and development projects that focuses on sustainable technologies, whether it's digital infrastructure, etc. I think that is really, really important. And then while we do that, we can also strengthen this our presence in these forums like the UN, the G20, which IBSA now will attach itself to, and more importantly, the COP meetings that we will see Brazil host next year. And this is another fundamental example of how we can use our peers to have the platform to come up with a position on a unified position on climate actions in terms of IBSA, where South Africa, Brazil, and India can come up with this common position. Today we speaking about the significance of IBSA, the need for it. We understand and we celebrate the success of IBSA by relaunching it, because we really understand that it's also the not having the knowledge and challenges that we face, but in terms of our economic diversities, our political context are varied, our regional tensions are varied, we have inefficiencies, and these are the reasons that hindered the progress in the past. But these challenges can really present opportunities of innovation and collaboration going forward. Some ideas that I just thought about, we could really launch a forceful communications pact in terms of how we highlight the achievements and the future goals of IBSA, and then strengthening it. But more importantly, when I sit back and reflect and I ask how would IBSA then impact the African continent, and I think it's clear, because IBSA serves as a long-term sustainability for trilateral partnership, which it rests on a more conscious engagement with regional partners. And in this case, I think by means of our strong regional leadership roles in which the countries play, strategically positioning India for South Asia, South Africa for the Southern African region, and Brazil for South America. I think this will legitimize the diplomatic partnerships between the IBSA states. And I think lastly, and I didn't take up all my 5 minutes, but I don't think it's a case of whether it's a possibility. I think IBSA is a necessity for global development, and I think that it's important going forward. And as the African Union and the South Africa, based in South Africa, we will definitely support South Africa in its goals and aspirations on taking some of these key priorities forward into next year's presidency.
The Global South is really has sort of three qualities to it. One is, in most cases, a post-colonial legacy, which, again, not always, not uniform. In cases like Latin America, this is sometimes now 100 plus years old. But I think that's important an important starting point. A second is a belated development and belated industrialization, particularly after the 1960s, after the immediate post-World War II order. And as a consequence of those two factors, it led to the political marginalization of much of these countries. So again, maybe not every country in the Global South checks all of those boxes, but these are really the cardinal features of what constitutes the Global South. And this in turn informs what the contours of a Global South agenda have looked like over the past 2 or 3 years in particular. And they've come to the fore in the past 2 or 3 years because of a number of events. The first item to me in the Global South agenda has been, and we've heard this multiple times over the past 2 hours, has been lack of institutional reform. And associated with that, the issue of debt financing, which Sherpa brought to the fore just now. And this leads to, ultimately, if these countries are not sufficiently represented at, say, the IMF, the questions and the terms of them getting out of their debt burdens is really something that is not in their hands. And so I think reclaiming that has become a central element to the Global South agenda. And this was exacerbated by the debt taken on during the COVID pandemic. The second has been a combination of food, energy, and health security, and a pervasive feeling in the Global South that the countries of the Global South were at the back of the queue when it came to food, energy, and health security. A third area has been climate justice, again, something that has come up a lot recently, and I won't go into a lot of detail on that. And the fourth is on the lack of focus on the development agenda. That is, because of these geopolitical developments, the SDGs have not always been front of mind for members of the global north. And this in turn is tied to questions of trade as well, and equitable trade. Now, if this is the contours of the agenda that India, Brazil, and South Africa, as 3 large democratic leaders in the Global South, want to advance, the question is how. And it seems, for all the talk of, well, we need to do a lot together, really no one is going to take IBSA or any other organization seriously unless it can do one of 3 things, and ideally all. And that is 1, have money and put money behind it. 2, share knowledge, and that includes lessons learned, includes technology. And 3, building up a solid political coalition, and that includes the power of the pen, the ability to draft an agenda. And unless IBSA is able to do 1 and ideally all 3 of those things, it will not be seen as a viable instrument for advancing the agenda of the Global South. And then lastly, as Dr. Chaturvedi mentioned at the end, SDGs. And if there is going to be an SDG review in a very short time, these are 3 countries that are very well equipped to advance concrete proposals. So this one basket, I think, of institutional reform really seems to have a lot of resonance. And I think the question is really what to prioritize within these issues. The second, I think, is putting money behind this initiative. And while there is an IBSA fund, the question of how can this be expanded? Should it be continued? Should it be focused on project financing, as it has been? Should it be an emergency fund that helps not just with project finance, but also providing fiscal support on a case-by-case basis? What is the governance behind that? And that, I think, is something that can be further explored. And then the third area that came out, I think, were the ability of these countries to share lessons learned, to be a resource for each other, whether in the digital realm, in the climate realm, in the developmental realm. Some of this is happening organically. And this is where, frankly, think tanks such as ours can play a useful role. We are doing that already. We're building up that people-to-people connect. The fellowship, the IBSA fellowship program that RIS runs is an excellent example. And I think whether that can be scaled up and whether other countries can contribute. CDRI was mentioned, or other more formal working groups around specific issues. And finally, this ability of the IBSA countries to provide capacity, to develop capacity in other countries in the Global South. So not just providing fellowships, for example, to each other, but also providing. So these, I think, were some of the issues that came up, I think, over the last couple of days, and have provided the contours of what an IBSA agenda can look like as it goes forward. And hopefully, I think we may not see a summit level meeting on Monday, although the 3 leaders will all be in town, but there will be other opportunities, including BRICS next year, which will also be hosted by Brazil, at COP next year, also hosted by Brazil, for IBSA to once again take flight.